Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Welcome to day 8 of Teaser season for patch 3.26 and the upcoming Secrets of the Atlas expansion. Don't go looking for days 6 or 7, they don't exist. There was nothing announced over the weekend. However, day 12 is going to be the big one. Day 12 is a day Grinding Gear Games are putting out all the information about what to expect in Secrets of the Atlas. But until then, we've got some teasers, and these ones are pretty juicy ones today. Previous ones have been focused on quality of life. This is new options for endgame crafting. Starting with something that is coming back. The Veiled Chaos Orb went bye-bye a couple of leagues ago. The Veiled Chaos Orb was in this interesting spot where it's kind of not used very often on real endgame crafts. It's also not something that's really good right at the start of gearing a character up when you first get to maps or whatever. But where it's really good is where you're trying to assemble a set of gear that's good enough to either get to the pinnacle bosses or potentially a little bit past that, you're trying to break into tier 17s. The Veiled Chaos Orb is going to be really useful for doing that. Now, for those of you that weren't playing back in the day, it is a weaker version of the modern day Veiled Orb. The Veiled Orb is being renamed Veiled Exalted Orb, and it's going to continue doing what it does now. So it removes a random modifier, then adds a random Veiled modifier to a rare item. Where the Veiled Chaos Orb really shines is that it's something that you can use a little bit more frivolously than a Veiled Exalted Orb or classic Veiled Orb. Those things are expensive. Veiled Chaos Orb, the last time it was around, there were two ways to get it. The first way was as a drop anywhere drop. You couldn't get it until, I believe, it may have been level 68 content, it may have been a little bit higher than that. So it wasn't something that you could get from the very start of the game. But once you got into maps, it was twice as rare as the Exalted Orb and the Divine Orb. Now, that sounds pretty rare. The thing is that there's just not a huge amount of demand for these in trade. The other thing was that the last time this existed, there was a deterministic way to farm them as well. If you did research safe houses with Ashling involved in them, then you would find in your rewards for killing Ashling that you would get some number of Veiled Chaos Orbs. So there was a deterministic way to get them as well as the non-deterministic drop anywhere aspect. This meant they were pretty accessible. They were something you could count on having early. The thing that made Veiled Chaos Orbs way better than they'd been previously though was the addition of Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds influence. What this allowed you to do was find a fractured item, and fractured items are compatible with Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds influence. You then apply various crafts to it, potentially fossils, potentially other methods. In order to get the prefix is pretty good if you already had a fractured suffix, or to get the suffix is pretty good if you had a fractured prefix. And then once you've done that, you could then apply a meta mod. Either prefixes can't be changed or suffixes can't be changed. Protect your three pretty good mods that are on it. And then you could apply a Veiled Chaos Orb to the item. What this would end up doing is locking 4 of those mods in place. So you'd have your fractured mod and your prefixes or your suffixes that you already thought were pretty good. They would be unable to change, and then the Veiled Chaos Orb would force the addition of a Veiled mod, which tend to be stronger than your average modifiers on items. After that, you could then apply Searing Exarch currency, and if you were particularly disappointed with the outcomes that you got, you could even use Eldritch Orbs of Annulment in order to potentially do things further from there. So this was a really common crafting system that ended up getting removed when they did the change from Veiled Chaos Orbs to the itemized Veiled Orb that we have at the moment. So in the future, we're going to have Veiled Chaos Orbs for middle tier progression, and we're going to have Veiled Exalted Orbs for later on than that. And that's the first of the new crafting orbs. So that's the first of the new crafting methods that's being added in 3.26. The other new crafting system is something that addresses a little bit of an asymmetry that exists in the game at the moment. Currently, there are 6 influence types that are what you might term classic influences: Shaper, Elder, and the 4 Elderslayer influences. However, only 4 of them have Exalted Orbs associated with them. So there is no such thing as a Shaper's Exalted Orb or an Elder's Exalted Orb. Well, there was no such thing until patch 3.26 is adding them. So the Shaper's Exalted Orb will presumably drop from the Shaper, although that's not confirmed. Likewise, we have the Elder's Exalted Orb. These will work exactly the same as the existing Redeemer's Exalted Orb. However, they do have a couple of differences that are important to note here. So whilst these functionally are going to mirror the existing Elderslayer influence orbs, they're going to be different in some of their applications. And I really want to call to your attention the Powerhouse use that exists unless Grinding Gear Games decide to change this by adding new modifiers into the pool. This is Shaper influenced shields. Imagine that you've got a Shaper's Exalted Orb, and imagine that you've just done a deal with Rog, and Rog has given you a shield that's got 3 outstanding suffixes on it, 2 prefixes you're content with, and it's not influenced in any way. What are you going to do at this point? Well, you're going to slam this thing with a Shaper's Exalted Orb, and you're going to provide it to someone that is playing a totem build. Why would you do this? let's have a look at the Shaper influenced mod pool that's available on shields. Now here I have the mod pool as it exists for strength-based shields. There are slight differences if you go strength int or dexterity only or whatever. They're going to be slightly different, but fundamentally all the important things are the same. Have a look here, there's a whole bunch of different prefixes, a whole bunch of different suffixes. You've probably rolled items that have got some of these before, or alternately, you've identified them. However, have a look at the entirety of the list of available prefixes for Shaper influence shields. That's right, there is exactly one of them. +1 to maximum number of summoned totems. This is an incredibly powerful mod on certain builds. Most builds don't want it, but the builds that do want it, this is absolutely phenomenal. And if you apply a Shaper influenced Exalted Orb onto a shield that does not have an influence type and that has 3 suffixes, so therefore it's not eligible to have a prefix added, you're going to guarantee, at least in the way the game is in 3.25, that the new mod is going to be +1 maximum totem. Now, I don't know if this is going to remain the case when 3.26 goes live. The reason I say this is that in the past there have been a couple of situations where crafting orbs have been this deterministic and they've provided an extremely powerful benefit with guaranteed to work. And in those situations, Granny Games have sometimes changed them. Now, it's not like you can't do this same isolation with other mods. For example, you can get 1% increased damage per 1% chance to block attack damage with the exact same approach, but slamming it with a Crusader Exalt instead. Or you can get elemental damage with attacks, or increased life, or increased AoE by using one of the other Elderslayer influences. But the thing is that none of these have the raw power that this Shaper prefix has. So, the example in the past where there's been something reasonably similar to this that's ended up getting nerfed was in the boot slot. In the boot slot, way back in Harvest League, and this was only the case for exactly one league, there was one very strong influence mod that existed that had the critical tag on it. And that was, you have Tailwind if you've dealt a critical strike recently. Now, at the time that this was added to the game, it had the critical tag on it. It does not now. And that didn't matter until along came Harvest League. When Harvest League came along, you're able to use any of Harvest's critical modifiers in order to deterministically add this to a set of boots that were already Hunter influenced. Because this was so deterministic and so strong, Granny Games ended up changing the way that those boots worked and removing the critical tag there. I don't know what they're going to do in this situation, but this is the single most powerful use case that I can think of when it comes to the Shaper's Exalted Orb. Now, one thing I want to raise when it comes to using Shaper's Exalted Orbs and Elder's Exalted Orbs is also when not to use these. I'm expecting these to be somewhat harder to source than the existing Elderslayer Exalted Orbs. The reason I say this is that it's just a bit more work to get to the Shaper again, or to get to the Elder again, and I'm presuming that they're probably going to drop from there. Of course, they could drop somewhere else. Who knows, Granny Games could decide to do something really weird and decide to have them drop from Uber Hillock. But I think it's a reasonable assumption that they probably drop from the bosses whose name they share. With that in mind, I'm expecting it's going to be easier to source, say, a Redeemer's Exalted Orb or a Hunter's Exalted Orb than it is to source an Elder's Exalted Orb. Additionally, these are also shiny and new, which tends to mean that in trade there'll be a bit more interest in them. The point here, don't use a shiny and new Shaper's Exalted Orb if you could achieve the same goal through using a Redeemer's Exalted Orb. What I'm talking about here is there is a harvest craft that allows you to randomize the influence on an influenced item. Now this removes all the mods that are on the item, so it's essentially like applying a Chaos Orb, but it also changes the influence type at random. For example, if you put in a Crusader influence set of gloves, then you've got a 20% chance of getting Shaper influence gloves back, 20% for Elder influence, 20% Redeemer, Warlord, and Hunter. Note that you will not get back the same influence that you put in, so it's not a 1 in 6, it's a 1 in 5. Now, what you can do with this, let's say that your end goal is to get yourself either a Hunter influenced or an Elder influenced Stygian Vice. And you don't care which of those two you get, but you want one of them because they both share the percentage life mod. Well, one pathway you can get is to use an existing Hunter influence orb, or alternately, one of the Elder's Exalted Orbs. You can potentially do it cheaper by trading for a Redeemer's Exalt, a Crusader Exalt, or a Warlord Exalt, slamming that on a Stygian Vice, and then using this Harvest Influence swap. Trade League players should do this if there is a big gap in prices between the different orbs, unless of course it's important to keep the mods that are already on your item. Solo self-found players will have different criteria for whether they do this or not, but it's important to keep it in mind as something in your toolkit in solo self-found play as well. Anyways, those are some of the things that I've thought of as use cases for the new Shaper Exalt and the Elder Exalt. And also, we have all of the discussion about the return of the Veiled Chaos Orb. I'm going to leave it there. May your Veiled Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.